Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Happy Labor Day, everyone, and welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. I hope you had a great summer with your family and friends. For me, Labor Day, it's always a reminder of what this country is supposed to be about. You know, the idea, the dignity of work, self-reliance, personal responsibility, the value of sacrifice, taking care of our families, our communities, and the idea that ordinary Americans, not government bureaucrats or elites, are the ones who actually keep this country running despite what they think. Now, as summer winds down, kids are going back to school, families shifting back into their normal routines, and it's the perfect time to ask, what kind of country are we handing down to them? Are we giving them a nation where institutions serve the people? Or are we letting these institutions be captured by ideology, weaponized against the very people they're supposed to protect? Now, before I dive in, a quick note. To keep the PAS report free and available to everyone, I've partnered with Podroll. So if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you may see a little bonus episode pop up with the label you may also like. That's Podroll. It's not the PAS report. It's a small way to support this podcast, ensure I can continue bringing you content without ever putting it behind a paywall. Takes a lot to produce these podcasts. It's not something that you just, click record and that's it. So help me, support me. I appreciate it all. And let's get to today's topic, because to me, Labor Day is supposed to be about honoring the American worker, the backbone of this nation. It's about celebrating the grit, the determination, the sacrifice that built the greatest country on earth, the most exceptional nation. And unfortunately, we have an entitlement problem. An entitlement problem that has infected our culture. Not only has it infected our culture, it's also infected many of our institutions, where you have these nameless and faceless government unelected bureaucrats who believe they have more power than duly elected officials, that they have more power than you, the people. And I want to provide an example which should outrage every single American, because a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., Department of Justice employee, someone whose very job it is to uphold the law, decided to throw a sandwich at members of the National Guard who were being deployed in D.C. to help stem the crime in our nation's capital. It's truly a disgraceful incident. It's an incident that never should have taken place. But if that wasn't bad enough, another DOJ employee thought it would be cute to record themselves flipping off the National Guard, mocking the men and women in uniform who are simply doing their jobs, screaming fascist, screaming dictator, authoritarianism. Now take it in for a second. These aren't activists chaining themselves to the White House gates. They're not activists that are going, stopping traffic in the middle of roads. These aren't random protesters in the street. These are federal employees paid by your tax dollars, or at least they were being paid. Thankfully, the DOJ has fired these employees. But these employees decided that their personal politics matter more than duty, more than respect, more than basic decency. And it goes even further, because you have a Washington, D.C. judge and grand jury that refused to charge the sandwich thrower with assault. Now, think about that. If you or I or any ordinary American threw something at a local police officer, we'd be arrested on the spot, charged with assault, no questions asked. Yet because this case involved a federal employee targeting National Guard troops over President Trump's policy, suddenly the rules change. And the message is crystal clear that assault is excusable if it's done for the right political reasons. See, it's that kind of double standard that has corroded our society, corrupted it, and it tells us the laws no longer applied equally. It's weaponized. It's weaponized based on where you fall politically. Now, some will argue, well, what's the big deal? They have a First Amendment right to protest. It's just a sandwich. Nobody got hurt, or it's just a middle finger. Well, first off, even when exercising your First Amendment right to protest, you don't have the right to infringe on someone else's liberties. You don't have the right to assault them, whether it's spitting on people or throwing sandwiches at them. But more importantly, here's why it matters. It matters because the mask has been ripped off. We can no longer ignore the obvious, that it gives us a window into the culture within our bureaucracy where far too many employees, they no longer see themselves as neutral civil servants that are there to serve the people. They see themselves as activists, as ideologues, as the guardians of what they perceive as democracy, warriors in a cosmic political battle where they believe they are more moral and superior to anyone that doesn't think like them. And that mindset doesn't just stay confined to a sandwich or a video. It bleeds into how these agencies operate, how decisions are made, how tax dollars are spent, how government power is used. The bureaucracy was never meant to be this way. The founding fathers, I talk about them often here at the P.A.S. Report podcast. The founding fathers never envisioned a massive, permanent bureaucratic state. In fact, they actually warned about it. They understood that as government expands, liberty contracts, that when people get into these government departments and agencies, they begin to get jaded. They're blinded. And human beings are capable of some really good characteristics, right? When we look at it, human attributes, courage, prudence, temperance, those are good human qualities to have. But we're also flawed. Jealousy, envy, hate, greed, lust, jealousy. These are terrible attributes. These are the flaws of human beings. And since human beings are the ones that create government, since we're the ones that create these institutions, those flaws begin to bleed into the agencies and the departments. And it's how we handle those flaws that matters. And that's why the founding fathers never meant for it to be this way. The founding fathers understood. And unfortunately, too many people have placed too much trust in the bureaucracy. Now, we're seeing that trust deteriorate rapidly because of the actions. But as the federal government grew, the idea was simple. Well, bureaucrats would simply carry out the missions of their agencies regardless of who occupied the White House. It was kind of irrelevant. You just did your job. The role was actually to serve, not to rule. Their duty was to implement policy, not to dictate it. And I want to make it clear. You do have a majority of civil servants that do operate this way. They're able to put their ideology aside. They're able to do their job. But over time, far too many have morphed into something else entirely, and that has corrupted the entire system. Instead of a body of professional civil servants, it's become an unelected political class, a shadow government that exists. And I constantly refer to it as the fourth branch of government that was never actually intended, but always warned about. A branch that operates outside the system of checks and balances. And because most of these employees lean heavily in one political direction, they've turned agencies into ideological machines, into ideological battlegrounds. When their side is in power, they fall in line. When the other side wins an election, they resist. They attempt to sabotage. They willfully obstruct duly elected officials. And that's why the DOJ employee with a sandwich actually matters, because it goes far beyond the sandwich. It's about an attitude that says, I don't have to respect the mission of my agency if it doesn't align with my own political beliefs. And once you accept that logic, you no longer have a neutral government. What you get is a weaponized government. And we've seen the consequences of this mindset in real time. So in today's episode, we're going to peel back the layers of this problem, because this isn't just about a few bad apples acting out. It's about a culture that has taken deep root in our institutions, a culture that says bureaucrats, not presidents, get to decide policy, a culture that undermines the foundation of our republic. And as we head into the school year, I'm going to show you how this bureaucratic capture, it's not happening in a vacuum. It mirrors the exact same ideological takeover that we've seen in our schools from kindergarten through college, where political activism has actually replaced education. The same imbalance that has infected academia in the classrooms for years has now seeped into every aspect of life, including the bureaucracy. And do you really believe that's a coincidence? The consequences of this groupthink mentality, this ideological capture, they're enormous for us in our country. And I'm going to expose just how deep the problem runs, why it's so dangerous, and what it means for America's future when we get back from a quick commercial break. So hang tight and we'll be right back. It's no secret that as we age, our bodies begin to break down. Now, if you want to move with ease and keep your skin glowing and youthful, you got to try Native Path Collagen. It's made with only type 1 and 3 collagen. These are the two most important types that make up 90% of your body's collagen, and they're found in your skin, bones, joints, and gut. They deliver powerful benefits without any fillers or additives. I have it every morning with my coffee, and it's a single ingredient, flavorless powder that mixes easily into the coffee. But you could also put it in smoothies, oatmeal. It's third-party tested for purity, and it absorbs fast thanks to its peptide form. With over 4 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, and 8,000 5-star reviews, Native Path is a brand you could trust, backed by a 365-day no-risk guarantee, live phone support where you talk to a real person. They make it easy to get started. So check out the bundle deals and join their private Facebook group for recipes and support. Visit getnativepath.com/PAS. That's getnativepath.com/PAS. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, we're talking about the ideological capture of the bureaucracy. That's the theme of today's episode, where bureaucrats believe that they're entitled to put their ideology above everything else. And when you look at what happened at the DOJ with the National Guard, it would be nice to say if these were just isolated incidents and that's it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The activist mindset exists throughout the entirety of the bureaucracy, and it was on full display last week at the CDC. You had Secretary Kennedy come out, announce policy changes, including that the COVID vaccine would no longer be recommended for healthy children, and all of a sudden there was this huge dispute. You have the CDC director, they disagreed with it, they ended up getting fired, several officials within the CDC resigned, but I want to focus on one CDC official because I think it really demonstrates how deep the problem is. You have Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis, who resigned in protest, and once he resigned, he decided to put out a diatribe on X, and I'm glad the official resigned. You know, people are free to walk away from a job they no longer believe in. I encourage it. If you don't like what this administration is doing, then resign in protest. Go ahead and spotlight it. I don't care. This guy, he did the right thing. Rather than remain in his position and work to undermine the policies of a duly elected administration from within, he chose to leave. That's the right thing to do. However, the diatribe does reveal the mindset of countless others that still remain in their positions. And you have Daskalakis declare that he couldn't serve in an environment where, in his words, treats the CDC as a tool to generate policies and materials that do not reflect scientific reality. Now, at first glance, sounds heroic, right? The image he tries to create is of a man standing for science, standing for the truth. But when you actually read the statement, that falls apart pretty quickly because he starts talking about vaccines, but somehow the post veers into accusations of fascism, where he talks about his grandfather standing up to fascist forces in Greece in World War II and dying for it, and how he believes he is following in his grandfather's footsteps by resigning, as if today compares to what was going on in the 1930s and 1940s. Then he goes into the whole LGBTQ issue. He advocates for transgenderism. So it's about science, but he's rejecting the basic tenets of biology. I don't see how that makes any sense whatsoever. But what does that have to do with public health recommendations on COVID vaccines, right? And absolutely nothing. Yet he lumps them all in together because for him, this was never just about science. It was always about ideology. And what's really telling is that he can't serve in a CDC that ignores science. That's what he's telling us. But where was that principled stand during the height of the pandemic? Where was the outrage when the CDC pushed the 6-foot social distancing rule, a rule that we know had zero scientific basis? Where was the resignation letter when schools were closed, in some cases for nearly 2 years, devastating kids academically, socially isolating themselves, leading to a mental health crisis that we're still dealing with to this very day? Even though we saw evidence show children were suffering, yet they weren't at serious risk of COVID, we locked them up. Where was the outrage when kids and toddlers were forced to wear masks, when anyone was forced to wear masks, but especially kids and toddlers, even though studies found that there was no measurable benefit. And that was all studies prior to the coronavirus. Where was the concern when Americans were locked down, when businesses were collapsing, when people lost their livelihoods? There wasn't any concern then. He had no problem enforcing all of that. In fact, many in the CDC cheered it on. They lectured the public. They censored dissent. They used science as a bludgeon to force compliance. And if you dared disagree with them, they said you wanted to see people to die. They tried to destroy and malign your reputation. That's the problem. Because what they called science then was often just politics dressed up in a lab coat. True science is skeptical. It questions, it tests, it admits when it gets things wrong. But the activist wing of the bureaucracy doesn't treat science that way. They treat it like scripture, that it can never change, it never deviates. And anyone who questions the orthodoxy is branded as anti-science. And the irony of all this, when we look at what Secretary Kennedy actually did, he is one of the few people following the data. The overwhelming evidence shows that healthy children are at virtually no risk from COVID. The real danger lies with people over 60, especially those with pre-existing conditions, and everything is dangerous to those people. That's what the numbers tell us. That's what the science says. So Secretary Kennedy's approach, focusing resources on those who actually need protection, is far more rational. And it's far more grounded in evidence than the blanket recommendations we've had for the last 3 years. But because that doesn't align with the activist agenda, the bureaucrats inside the CDC can't handle it. They're mad. They claim science is being ignored when in reality it's their ideology that's being threatened. The ideology that they get to determine what's good for us, what's in our best interest, not we the people. And this is a bigger issue that we need to talk about. Bureaucrats are not supposed to dictate policy. Their role is to carry out the mission of their agency under the direction of the elected administration. As long as that elected administration is working within the constitutional boundaries, the bureaucrats are supposed to push forward those policies. That's it. They can advise. They could provide expertise, they could recommend different policy options, but at the end of the day, they don't get to decide and dictate. They're not elected by the people. They're not accountable to the voters. They're there to implement policy, plain and simple. Yet more and more within the bureaucracy, more and more bureaucrats act as if they are the ones in charge. Whether it's DOJ employees that want to throw sandwiches at National Guard troops, whether it's CDC officials trying to become martyrs on social media, the mindset is the same. We, the bureaucracy, are the ones who decide what this country does, not we, the people. And ask yourself, what would happen if you behaved this way in your own job? Like imagine your boss gave you a directive that was legal, is what the company's mission does, and part of the job that you agreed to when you were hired, and you said, well, I don't like it, so I'm not going to do what my boss is telling me. You'd be fired on the spot. And if you're someone that owns a business, what would you do if one of your employees says, yeah, I hear what you asked me to do, but I don't like that, so I'm not going to do it? What would you do? Of course you'd fire an employee because, again, that's how the real world works. But in government, too many bureaucrats think that they can simply override the elected leadership of the country because they know better. They're smarter than everyone else. And that's not how a republic works. You know, Congress and presidents are elected to set policy. Bureaucrats are hired to implement that policy. And the moment you flip that arrangement upside down, you no longer have a government that's accountable to the people. You have an unelected, permanent ruling class that answers to no one, that's unencumbered from the Constitution. That's what we're facing today. The bureaucracy has been captured. And instead of serving the American people, it now decides it's going to serve its own ideological interests. That's not science. That's not service, not based on democratic principles. That's activism. And that's the real danger. Unelected bureaucrats who start believing that they, not the president, not members of Congress, who are chosen by the people, but they get to decide the direction of this country. Now, we need to take a quick break. But when we get back, I'm going to show you the data and studies that prove this activist mindset and how it isn't just a few bad apples, how it's embedded throughout the entire federal apparatus. So everyone hang tight and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, before I jump back in, a couple of quick things. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode, and share this podcast with 5 friends and family members. That's how we grow this movement, by spreading the word. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, take a moment, leave a 5-star review. It only takes a minute, but it makes a huge difference in helping more people discover the show. And as we grow, we begin to take back this country. And let's get back to the topic of the day, because what I've laid out so far, you have employees throughout the federal apparatus, and I've given you examples from the DOJ, the CDC, plenty of times on this podcast. I've given examples of other agencies abusing their power. And while they're powerful examples, the data shows us this problem actually runs much deeper than most realize. And I want to start with the study out of UC Berkeley. You had researchers looking at how partisanship affects the federal workforce, and their findings were eye-opening. They concluded that political polarization among federal employees doesn't just exist, but it actively reduces efficiency, slows down projects, and it makes cooperation almost impossible. In other words, when ideology takes over, government doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And that's not me saying it. That's UC Berkeley, one of the most liberal universities in the entire country. They're essentially admitting that partisanship, that when you substitute ideology over the mission within the bureaucracy, that it is not only costly, but it's also corrosive. And then there's other studies that exist out there. You had thousands of political emails from career bureaucrats that were reviewed. Now, these were workplace emails coming from workplace email addresses. These weren't personal email addresses sent during personal time. Every federal bureaucrat has a right to do that on their own personal time. But this study found that these were career bureaucrats sending internal emails through government servers talking about day-to-day politics. And the study found that 95% of the political views expressed by federal employees in emails were to the left of the political spectrum, were progressives. Not 60%, not 70%, 95%. I mean, this gives you an idea of the ideological balance inside the federal government and how completely lopsided it is. And it gets even worse than that, because when you look at the management level, according to the same study, 42% of federal managers openly stated that they believe they should resist President Trump's policies. I want you to think about that for a second. These are unelected, faceless bureaucrats who have taken it upon themselves to say, well, we don't like this president, so we're going to resist him. We think he's a fascist. We think he's an authoritarian. He's a dictator. Now, let me ask all of you out there something. If President Trump was truly a fascist or an authoritarian or a dictator, do you think these career civil servants would be allowed to behave this way? See, this isn't the role of bureaucrats. Their job is to carry out the policy of the elected administration, regardless of who's in office. But in their minds, their personal ideology matters more than the will of the American people. And when you isolate just the Democrat-leaning managers, that number skyrockets. 73% of them said they believed they needed to resist President Trump and his policies, that it's their duty to resist him. 73%. That's not civil service. That's an activist army operating within our government on the inside. And here's the part that should scare every single American. The mindset isn't necessarily limited to Trump or Republicans. While Trump and Republicans face far more pushback in the bureaucracy than the Democrats do, we've even seen pushback on Democrat administrations. I mean, just think back to 2023. Hundreds of Biden administration officials, not just junior staffers, but people across government agencies, particularly within the State Department, signed letters demanding that President Biden call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And they're trying to dictate foreign policy to the commander-in-chief. That's not their job. They're not elected. They don't answer to the voters. And if they disagree that strongly with Biden's policy, the honorable thing to do would have been to resign in protest. But that's not what they did. They stayed in place. They tried to bend the policy from the inside. They tried to override the decisions of the person who was duly elected to make them. And it demonstrates the bigger pattern here, that these bureaucrats believe they run the country. They believe they get to decide which policies are valid and which ones aren't. And if they don't like a policy, they either resist it, undermine it, or they just ignore it as if it doesn't exist. So this flips the entire system upside down. Presidents are supposed to set policy. Bureaucrats are supposed to implement it, plain and simple. The moment bureaucrats start thinking they're the policymakers, that they're more important than the president or Congress, you no longer have a government that's accountable to the people anymore. You have a government by the bureaucracy to support the administrative state. And I could give you another data point, because it ties this all together. In the 2024 election cycle, 84% of political donations from federal employees went to Kamala Harris's campaign instead of Donald Trump's. 84%. Now, the country is pretty evenly divided. No matter where you go to California. 60% of the people in California are registered Democrats and support Democrats and elect Democrats, but you do have 40% voting Republican. Same thing holds true in New York. If you go to Texas, all right, 60% are Republicans, but there's still 40% Democrats there. And so you look at the country, and it's pretty evenly split. Yet when we see these contributions, it's a clear indication that the bureaucracy is not reflective of the American people at all. Not only do we see the imbalance in surveys and studies, but it shows up where federal employees put their money. And these aren't neutral civil servants. Let's be clear about this. This is an institution that overwhelmingly leans in one direction. It shows in their behavior. And to be clear, I want to make this crystal clear. They have every right to make political contributions. You know, the First Amendment applies to all Americans, including bureaucrats. But when the overwhelming majority of those contributions go to one party, and when those same bureaucrats are responsible for carrying out policy, does it not create a conflict of interest? I mean, let's be honest here. Once you've invested financially in a political candidate, you now have a vested interest in seeing that person and that party succeed, do you not? It becomes very difficult to claim you're a neutral, unbiased civil servant carrying out the will of all Americans. And this is why we see the double standards. This is why we see selective enforcement and weaponization of government power. It's not about one or two bad apples. And to be fair, there are countless civil servants who do incredible work every single day who are able to put their personal beliefs, their personal ideology aside to serve the American people with integrity and professionalism. But we have this culture of the bureaucracy itself that's been captured. And once the culture is captured, no matter how many good people you have, the institution can no longer function the way it was intended. Instead of neutrality, you're going to get ideology. Instead of accountability, you're going to get sabotage. Instead of trusting government, you get a system that most Americans no longer believe is fair. And that's what the polls are showing. This is why the issue is so dangerous, because if the bureaucracy continues down this road, it doesn't matter who wins an election. The people inside these agencies are going to keep trying to override the will of the voters. And when that happens, the whole foundation of the republic is at risk. Now, I'm going to wrap this all up when we get back from a quick commercial break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So we've spent the episode looking at how the federal bureaucracy, how the bureaucrats in office, how it's been captured by ideology, how DOJ employees believe it's completely acceptable to assault and flip off the National Guard troops that are stationed in Washington, D.C. It's where FBI officials can label Catholics as potential domestic violent extremists, all because they don't like where Catholics stand on the issues, that Catholics believe that God made two genders. It's the same mindset that led to the Merrick Garland school board memo where parents were basically labeled as domestic terrorists. So we've seen how this affects us. We've seen the studies that show the imbalance that runs through the entire system. But here's the thing. It's not happening in a vacuum. It mirrors exactly what's been going on in the education system for decades. And as the kids go off back to school, we have to discuss it, because I want you to think about it. In K through 12 education, even in solid red states, even in solid Republican states, surveys consistently show that teachers support Democrats over Republicans by margins of 80 to 90%. That means that the people teaching our kids overwhelmingly lean in one political direction. So Do you think that imbalance doesn't bleed into what's taught in the classroom? I mean, just look at education curriculums throughout the United States. Look at how biased they are. Look at the culture of our schools, and look at the failed education system where students are not even proficient in pretty much any subject level. You have basically a 23% proficiency level if we combine all the subject material together. Students can't read or write at grade level. And it gets even worse at college, right? You have academic disciplines that are so lopsided they become political echo chambers. Look at sociology. The ratio of Democrats to Republicans among faculty, it's not 2-1. It's not even 10-1. It's 64-0. Zero conservatives, zero Republicans, zero intellectual diversity. It's not limited to sociology. We see this in other fields in social sciences. They're not as bad as sociology, but they're not that far behind. You look at something like anthropology. This isn't education. This is indoctrination. And just like the bureaucracy, once the culture of an institution is captured, neutrality disappears. In education, you no longer have classrooms dedicated to expanding young minds. You get activism. It's disguised as learning, but it's not learning. You get children taught what to think, not how to think. And just like in government, once ideology takes over, accountability vanishes. Where is the accountability of a failed education system? I mean, the fact that the overwhelming majority of students cannot demonstrate proficiency level in the subject material, where's the accountability in that? But when you speak out against it, well, dissent isn't tolerated. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to drop the standards to try and cover up their failures. See, different perspectives will be shut out, and we're just going to create smoke and mirrors. This is why nobody trusts anything anymore. Does anyone have trust in the academic system anymore? Does anyone have trust in government anymore? So the parallel is important. Our bureaucracy in our schools were supposed to serve the American people. Bureaucrats were supposed to carry out the mission of their agencies. Teachers and professors supposed to educate students, prepare them for the future. Instead, both have been hijacked by activists who see it as their job to push an agenda. And what's the result? Well, the ideologues leave the schools they graduate from and infect whatever industry they go into. So they become the journalists who slant the news. They become the corporate executives who push woke policies, as we just recently saw with Cracker Barrel. They become the bureaucrats who weaponize government power. And this vicious cycle continues because they become the teachers who are going to indoctrinate the next generation of students. So instead of bringing balance, innovation, diversity of thought into their professions, what are they going to do? They're going to carry the same rigid ideology that they were taught in the classroom. So over time, this is what creates that groupthink mentality. This is what creates the echo chambers across our most important institutions, whether it be the media, government, healthcare, the private sector, where dissent and is no longer tolerated, voices are silenced, and conformity is what's demanded. That's why in the previous administration, Jen Easterly, the CISA director, wanted to label cognitive thoughts as cognitive infrastructure to control what we could see, what we could say, what we could hear. The bottom line on this Labor Day, as we honor the American worker, as we celebrate the values that built this great nation, we have to remember America is strong not because of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy makes us weaker, that's for sure. It's not strong because of the elites of these people in power. It's strong because of its people, ordinary Americans who wake up every day, who work hard, who raise their families. But if we continue to allow our institutions to be completely consumed by ideology, then us ordinary Americans, we're going to be left without a government that serves us. This is where you get into the dictatorship of the bureaucracy. That's why we have to push back. We have to demand accountability. We have to call out the double standards, the selective enforcement, the ideological capture. We can't accept this as normal because it's not normal. And the moment we begin to accept it, it's going to be game over. Maybe not in a year from now or 2 or 5 or 10 years from now, but sooner or later, it's game over. And as we close out the summer, our kids returning back to school, thank God for that. I can't wait. We have an obligation to protect the integrity of the Republic. We have an obligation to make sure that government serves the people, not the other way around. To make sure our schools educate, not indoctrinate. And to remind those people in power to remind them that they're not gods. They're not above the people, that they work for us. They're there to serve us, not the other way around. Now, I want to thank you for joining me this Labor Day episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget, share it with your family and friends. Hit the subscribe button. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I hope you have a great week. Enjoy the holiday. I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast, so you're going to want to make sure you keep it here.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at PAS Report.